And in conjunction with this will be the first finger, which occasionally when I'm playing treble notes, such as, if I want to give them a tremolo effect, I'll reach over and have the first finger kind of just bridge across the other strings to keep them quiet. So the left-hand technique of finger dampening is used also with a tremolo effect if you were going to stretch a note, or if you were just to tremolo back and forth. This especially is where the finger will hold the strings from vibrating. If you're just holding any kind of note, it keeps the others from making noise, especially if you're tremoloing. And as you finish a phrase, then sometimes you'll use your fingers in combination with what I discussed earlier about the post dampening of the side of the right thumb. It just kind of puts your hands across it and kind of keep them from feeding back. It's a process of trial and error of how you can learn through the idiosyncrasies and personal style techniques that you have, how to be everywhere to kind of have the off between the ons of when you're playing the notes. And I kind of think of it as almost a ballet, because if you were to kind of watch the working, it's kind of like a choreography that has to happen. And eventually, if through trial and error, you can kind of, it becomes second nature for a lot of that attempt of it, where you don't have to really think about it so much. But it's a very, very critical part of playing. Maybe not noticed as much as it should be, but what you don't play is a lot of times as important as when you are playing. So I'd like to just a second maybe run through the amps and just do some improvisations, and maybe you be able to just kind of watch just the dampening thing, in particularly more than maybe even the musical passages. The next section I'd like to talk about is string stretching. And basically, there's three types that I like to use. Some of these have been covered somewhat on the first video. The first one is called positive string stretching. That is where you practice and you learn to, as you stretch the string, to go right to the next note you want to. So if you were stretching a whole note, or a half note, or if you were doing a minor third, it's a method of where you know the exact note you're going to go to. The best way to kind of do that is if you have a recorder, you can record some chord stuff and then play over it and just make sure you're working on being in tune. That is something that's really important to work on because it gives a more positive approach to stretching the string rather than just aimlessly kind of stretching around, which will not sound quite as tasteful to do. And then besides that technique, there'd be more of the semitone type stretching, which is where you find kind of a place in between. And that's very well used with blues players. It's such as if you listen to B.B. King. It's always helpful to listen to blues records to kind of get that kind of inflection down. It's very useful no matter what kind of style you end up playing. And then another way that I like to kind of stretch strings is where I kind of stretch it and then pick the note. It's just kind of a fun thing I like to do. It kind of can mimic kind of a slide guitar type sound. You can also kind of get a steel guitar sound of it. Other variations on string stretching that I like to do is a technique, kind of a koto technique, which is a relatively simple technique to do. It involves both hands where you fret with the first finger of your right hand, and when you do that, you pick with the thumb of the right hand. And then you also can fret with the third finger of the left hand. But while you are fretting with your right hand, you can use that third finger of the left hand to actually stretch the note behind the note. Gives it kind of an interesting tone because you're actually picking right next to where you're fretting. So it's a little thinner and kind of koto-ish sounding. And so there's two ways you can do that. You can either stretch the note as you pick it on the right hand, by the left hand, or you can pop off the note from the right and leave the note on the left hand like. Another technique is the two-note stretch, where you actually do two notes at once. Last little bit again. So another way you could also color the type steel stuff if you're doing the two-note stuff is, as we discussed earlier, you can stretch the note up and then pick it. Bit. And you also can add to that volume control. technique with the volume control really is just using the little finger around it, and you have to kind of play a little early on the beat and then fade it in so that when the fade in will be right on the beat. Of course, you also can use a volume pedal. And if you use this technique with some compression and echo in the studio, it can create quite a non-guitar sound, which is real nice. So the next section I'd like to talk about is vibrato. This is what I feel is a very important technique because it can really, it can portray a very genuine sound to your playing that's very tasteful. And you can really learn it from a lot of the old blues players. I kind of learned the type of tremolo I like from Eric Clapton in the Cream. And also you can hear a lot of wonderful vibrato from Jimi Hendrix on the Electric Ladyland album. The way Clapton would do it is he would pivot his wrist. He wouldn't clench the guitar like this. I mean, some ways people, when they vibrato and they hold the guitar tight, what happens is you have a stiff, kind of constrained sounding vibrato. Now, if I was to take my hand away from the guitar and just let it just be open there and let the power come from the pivot of the wrist. As you can see underneath, there's a pivot point with the wrist, and it's supplying energy to the finger that you're stretching the string and give vibrato. This also can be used to go down. Same technique, but in a more subdued way, can be used just to give vibrato holding a note. It doesn't require as much pivot of the wrist, but you can leave your hand free. While you do this, as we discussed earlier, you'll want to use the dampening technique around those notes. And another thing that I like to kind of do is within a chord context, you might have one note vibratoing and not have the others. For instance, on the last record on the song Pavilion, I tried to bring out a high note to vibrato without doing the other ones, such as... This also can be done with a cleaner tone. It adds a little differentiation to the voicings you're using, kind of like having a melody within the chord. And so one of the final types of tremolo I'd like to talk about, which basically I like to do on acoustic guitar, but every once in a while for a kind of a real soulful sound, you want to maybe use it on electric, where you just tremolo the effect. It's a classical technique, just going back and forth. Now, the next section of this video, I'd like to talk about 4 major aspects of playing that I kind of try to remember when I'm working on whether it's solos, chords, writing, or whatever. Because there's an old saying, really, it's not what you play, but it's how you play it. So it doesn't matter what style or where you're coming from, but it's like, how do you play what you're playing? And there's some real cardinal universal tips to help put a special, kind of put like a spunk in your playing or whatever. So these are parameters I like to use to sharpen the musical language that's involved for a better message of music. The first one I'm going to call projection, which is projecting your playing. That has to do with note selection. Which notes do you want to use at a particular given place? I mean, I could run through a passage, or I could just say. See, I played the same thing. It's just the way that you select the notes and the alliteration and which one comes after the other. Or another way I could do it, instead of playing it generically, I could go. So there's a myriad of ways to approach that. Now, once you've selected the notes you want to play, it's how do you treat the note? You can use a staccato effect where you just. There's all different variances in the staccato, how much you use. The staccato thing is basically we're just using more dampening. And sometimes you want to use a legato type thing with a long sustain, so you use less dampening on the right hand and more dampening on the left hand to get more legato. You can mix these up if you want. And then also another part of the projection is the emotion you're trying to get. What's the desired emotion? Is it kind of more pensive, like say if you wanted to... Or is it more off the cuff kind of thing? Kind of thing like that. So you can really dial in the type of emotion you want to do by just playing the same thing basically, but just the way you play it. Such as